G'day, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the third season of the History in the Bible podcast. In this final season, I explore how the Jews and the Christians constructed new religions when they were sent spinning into the void after the destruction of the temple. All of the history about all of the books beyond the Bible. Episode 3.3. Before the Great Revolt, Part 1, the Judeans. In the last episode, I presented the history of the Judeans under the Hellenistic kingdoms and the astonishing literature it produced. Time to move forward to the Roman Empire, just before the Great Revolt broke out in the year 66. Our best guess is that 3 to 4 million Judeans lived in the Roman Empire and 1 million in the Parthian Empire, beyond the remit of Rome. The Parthians ruled Mesopotamia as the successors to the Seleucids. To this day, we call this population of Judeans Babylonian, even though they spent only 60 years under the empire's rule. We know almost nothing about the lives of the Judeans living in Parthia. We know something about the lives of those active in the Roman Empire. Of the Judeans within the Roman Empire, anywhere from 1/2 to 1 million lived in the province of Judea, perhaps the same in Egypt, and the rest elsewhere in the empire. Depending on how we cut these very shaky numbers, anywhere from 1/3 to 3/4 of Roman Judeans lived outside the Judea-Egypt axis. By the year 66, Judeans had enjoyed over a century of Roman rule. They had established communities along the entire eastern coast of the Middle Sea, from Greece to Anatolia, Cyprus to Syria. They had a substantial presence in Rome. Paul had spread his message through these communities in his 3 missionary journeys. As did other ethni, Judeans tended to congregate in their own locales. For reasons we don't understand, all the ancient synagogues we have found lie outside these boroughs. There was nothing outwardly different about Judeans. They were not distinctive because of their looks, clothing, speech, names or occupations. Many other ethni wore idiosyncratic clothing or monopolised certain jobs. In popular culture, the Judeans are depicted as a tiny, beleaguered and oppressed religious group, fighting for freedom from their Roman tyrants. As I want to make clear, this is far from the truth. From the late Republic on, the Roman Senate was always willing to listen to the Judean communities. The magistrates established laws protecting the free exercise of the practices of the Judean ethnos, just as they had for other ethni. The Romans had no interest in suppressing worship on the Sabbath or the observation of the great festivals. The Romans permitted the Judeans to conduct what they thought of as ritual genital mutilation, though the Romans regarded it with disdain. And the Egyptians had the same practice. Though the Romans were wary of secret societies, they allowed the Judeans to construct thiasoi. These were organisations allowed to practice in communal and private ways, beyond the prying eyes of the state. Many of these thiasoi were Greek, such as the cult of Dionysus. The Judeans were also exempt from pagan rituals, many of which celebrated the Roman state and civic order. The Judeans were also exempt from compulsory service in the Roman army, although many volunteered as mercenaries in various armed forces. Anyone who attempted to confiscate money destined for the temple in Jerusalem was liable to prosecution. The Romans liked their empire nice and quiet, and the capital especially so. The usual suspects were regularly ejected from the city. A decade before Jesus began his mission, the Emperor Tiberius threw out astrologers, the followers of Isis, and the Judeans from the capital. Now, they were allowed to remain in Italy as long as they gave up their scandalous practices. I suspect most departed the peninsula. According to a few ancient authors and the Book of Acts, the Emperor Claudius expelled Judean malcontents 10 to 20 years after Jesus' death. Now, Claudius, of course, was indifferent to the internal affairs of the Judean community. His aim was civic harmony. It is entirely possible that the Judeans were just a convenient group whose expulsion could serve as an example to the city populace as a whole. The emperors had modified the old Roman religion to sanctify themselves and the state. It was a flexible and accommodating edifice. This construction had no sacred books, no code of laws. The devotees of Isis, for example, were perfectly free to believe whatever they wanted, as long as they made the odd sacrifice to the emperor every so often. The pagan citizens of the empire followed many religions. Some worshipped gods they imagined took the form of men. Others depicted their gods in the shape of animals. And some saw their gods embodied in rocks. They shared no organised religious social structures. They didn't even agree on which gods were real. All the ethni in the empire were happy to live in a world of other people's gods. This is in marked difference to the modern world. 3/4 of the people on our planet live in countries where religious differences are major social causes of hostility and often government oppression. The Judeans stood out amongst other ethni for their insistence that they, and only they, had got the whole God thing right. They passed this dogma down to Christians. The Judeans and Christians fanatically maintained that these other gods were frauds, their worshippers misguided at best, and evil at worst. To many citizens of the empire, this Judean and later Christian quirk was bigoted and offensive. The Roman historian Tacitus said of the Judeans, "Towards every other people they feel only hate and enmity." His friend Governor Pliny laid exactly the same charges against Christians. Tacitus also accused the Judeans of separation. They sit apart at meals and they sleep apart. The disciple Peter confirms that. In this passage from the book of Acts, Peter arrives at the house of the Roman centurion Cornelius. Quote, Acts 10:24. Cornelius was expecting them and had called together his relatives and close friends. On Peter's arrival, Cornelius met him and, falling at his feet, worshipped him. But Peter made him get up, saying, "Stand up, I am only a mortal." And as he talked with him, he went in and found out that many had assembled. And he said to them, "You yourselves know that it is unlawful for a Judean to associate with or to visit a Gentile. But God has shown me that I should not call anyone profane or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without objection." End quote. This attitude of Peter's was uncommon. Now, the Romans admitted that the Judeans attracted converts, often very aristocratic ones. This implies that Judeans did not separate themselves totally from their neighbours. At some point, perhaps after the Judean revolts, this quirk became perceived as not just part of the Judean ethnos, but as its defining characteristic. The Greek word ioudeos means Judean, and it came to refer not to the ethnos, but to the religion of that ethnos. The city of Alexandria in Egypt remained a unique and troubling case within the empire. Egypt was the richest province in the empire, the breadbasket of Rome. The native Egyptians were third-rate citizens, below the Romans, Greeks, and Judeans. Alexandria was the second city of the empire and its intellectual centre. Both the Judeans and the Greeks ran a city within a city in Alexandria. We have ample evidence that wherever Greeks and Judeans cohabited in a town, trouble was usually not far away. They simply did not get on. The Greeks even had a specific term for their incessant bickering: stasis. Now, unfortunately, that word stasis is transliterated into English as the word stasis. Where the English word stasis means inactivity, the Greek stasis is the exact opposite. In ancient Greek, stasis refers to violent political dissension or insurrection within a body politic. Greek cities before the Roman period were infamous for their ongoing stasis between warring factions. The Greeks were no strangers to internecine political violence. Neither were the Judeans. The years of the Maccabean kings through to Herod the Great saw many an insurrection. In the decades after the death of Jesus, the 40s through the 60s, violent stasis erupted several times in Alexandria over the question of civic rights. We don't know whether the Judeans of Alexandria were fighting for their privileges or to acquire new ones. We don't know if they evaded taxes or outright denied they were liable for them. We don't know if they were protecting their identity against the Greeks or the native Egyptians. The emperors quelled the riots, slapped both sides on their collective wrists, and reaffirmed the rights of Judeans not only in Alexandria, but throughout the empire. The state punished attacks on Judean properties. It tried its best to respect the rights of both Judeans and Greeks, while minimising tension between the two warring ethnic. We may have a modern analogue for the stasis between Judeans and Greeks 2,000 years ago. This analogue is a stasis not between Jews and Gentiles, but between sectarians. In late 2020, Orthodox Haredi communities in Israel violently objected to the state's actions to suppress the pandemic. Here is what Shmuel Rosner, then political editor of the Jewish Journal, said about that. Long quote. Haredi neighbourhoods and towns tend to be less than hospitable to outsiders. And as the neighbourhoods expand, clashes with neighbours are common. In Jerusalem, where these Jews live in great and fast-growing numbers, a puzzled public begins to feel these communities have become too independent. Like many closed communities, Haredi Judeans are suspicious of outside institutions. When outsiders demanded they shut down schools or cancel weddings or stop attending their synagogues, many of the leaders were thinking that such a decree could only come from people who do not understand the importance of these practices. They refused to comply. Haredi Jews are well practiced in defying the larger society in which they live, and defiance is the tool they pulled out when new pandemic rules were dictated. Of course, they have every right to use political clout to make their case. It is also reasonable to assume that in some cases, Haredi Jews are being singled out. And yet it is time for Haredi leaders to realise that their model of isolation from the larger public is becoming archaic. Not because it failed, but because it succeeded. End quote. So much for the state of the Judeans throughout their diaspora in the Roman Empire. What of the Judean homeland? The Romans regarded the Promised Land as a dull and near desolate area between the rich and populous provinces of Egypt to the south and Syria to the north. But they were mindful that the region was a trade corridor, through which precious cargoes passed between those wealthy provinces. To their perpetual frustration, the region was populated by a posse of squabbling tribes. There were Syrians in the north. Greek cities dotted the Mediterranean coast and the area east of the Jordan. Judeans occupied the areas of Galilee and Judea proper. Between these two were the hapless Samaritans. South of Judea were the Idumeans, forcibly converted to Judaism. And surrounding all were the desert Arabs and the Nabateans. It was all a right muddle, creating a geopolitical situation that makes the Balkans look like Japan. The region was a nightmare well before the Romans arrived. Before the Roman general Pompey rolled down the Mediterranean coast to subjugate the area, the Judeans had endured a century of bloody and inept rule under the Maccabean kings. Good Queen Alexandria, one of the few competent monarchs of her dynasty, died in 67 BCE. I have a full accounting in episode 2.5, The Rise and Ruin of the Maccabeans. Her son John Hyrcanus II had been high priest during Alexander's reign, but with no civil authority. Upon his mother's death he usurped the throne. He dismissed his brother Aristobulus with the same contempt that their mother had shown for him. Aristobulus was a spoiled, lazy brat. To the astonishment of all, Aristobulus leapt into action. With the help of some mercenaries who proved quite persuasive on the battlefield, Aristobulus quickly convinced John to abdicate in favour of himself. Just a year after their mother's death, Aristobulus was king. Although Aristobulus left John both alive and with a handsome income, John soon regretted his abdication. Enter now one Antipater, whom a previous Maccabean monarch had installed as the native puppet governor of Idumea, the region south of Judah. Seething in the wings while his brother reigned, John brought Antipater on board as a political strategist. Antipater thought it would be a jolly idea to enlist the Nabatean Arabs to help John besiege Aristobulus in his stronghold of Jerusalem. They were doing so with some success when ominous news arrived. The Roman general Pompey was marching towards Judah. The rivals each appealed personally to Pompey. An independent Judean embassy to Pompey beseeched him to dispose of both idiots and abolish the Maccabean monarchy. Well, that's saying something, isn't it? Pompey eventually plumped for John, but John would rule not as a king, but an ethnarch, a governor. Aristobulus was taken to Rome in chains. For almost 2 decades, the Roman Republic was racked by civil war, at first between Pompey and Julius Caesar, then Caesar's assassins against Antony and Octavian, then finally Antony against Octavian. Romans of all stripes agreed. The Maccabeans were ditzes at best and half-wits at worst. Antipater presented himself as a viable alternative to the Maccabean claimants. Although Antipater died in the same year as Caesar, Antony and Octavian resolved in 37 BCE to establish his son Herod as not just ethnarch, but king of Judea. The Romans well knew they had to manage the diverse ethne to produce stable governance. They had to cultivate the local elites, offering opportunities to fulfill their aspirations. The obvious solution was to install a local ally as governor or king. They had many ethne to choose from: Judeans, Arabs, Syrians, Greeks, Samaritans, Idumeans. By choosing Herod, they recognised the Judean influence in the region, and they also accepted that by choosing Herod, Roman rule would be centred in Jerusalem. Of course, the real power lay in the legions stationed in Antioch, capital of mighty Syria. But they were 10 days away by legionary march. The Roman choice of a Judean to run the joint went down a treat with his compatriots. Herod's new dynasty promised to end decades of fratricidal warfare within the Maccabean house and bring stable government. In the first half of his rule, Herod was a remarkably deft king, a shrewd survivor, navigating the roiling waters of both Roman and Judean politics. He defeated military threats to his kingdom from petty neighbours several times, knowing that the Romans always had his back. He transformed Judea into a model Roman client state. To the discomfiture of his Jewish subjects, Herod accommodated his Gentile subjects by respecting their beliefs and traditions. Contrary to popular opinion, the Roman relationship with the Judeans was one of the stronger ones. The Romans supported the Judeans and Herod's dynasty against others for 80 years, even when Herod's successors proved to be mostly complete idiots. Whenever the Judeans had an issue with their neighbours, they always turned to Rome to sort out the problem. As it had been since the return from Babylon, the centre of the Judean religion was the temple. The temple had been built and rebuilt several times since the time of Solomon. Although we know it as the Second Temple, Herod's massive expansions really made it the second temple. By the time Herod the Great finished his renovations, around 10 BCE, the immense edifice was the largest in the Roman Empire until the Colosseum, built by the Emperor Vespasian 80 years later. The temple compound was the seat of the most powerful political class in the land, the priests. Theocratic rule was deeply embedded in the Judean psyche. The celebrity Jewish Roman historian Josephus believed it the best form of government for his people. Even the sectarian Essenes at Qumran created their own tiny theocracy, probably run by exiled Zadokite priests. The temple was the only sanctuary that Judeans could righteously conduct the sacrifices demanded for the great festivals. Each year, every male in the empire paid a few days' wages to support the priests and their temple. That added up to a very tidy sum indeed, enough to pay for thousands of skilled labourers every year. Temple priests were rolling in dosh. There were plenty of Judeans who thought the temple corrupt, the Pharisees and Essenes amongst them, but they had to concede that the temple was the embodiment of the Jewish state and the paramount seat of power. But there were alternatives. In the Hellenistic period, when the successors of Alexander ruled the eastern Mediterranean, Judeans developed another place in which they could commune with God. This was the synagogue. This is a Greek word meaning congregation or assembly, a near synonym for the Greek word ekklesia, the term that Christians later adopted. The synagogue was some sort of communal institution, a local clubhouse. Many were funded by pagans. Clubhouses evolved independently in the land of Israel and in the Jewish communities outside the land. A clubhouse in Israel was nothing like a clubhouse in Egypt. Depending on geography and time, a clubhouse could be a place of prayer, a place of meeting, or a place of teaching. It was rarely all three. Outside of Judea, Greek-speaking Judeans used the rare Greek word proseuche, prayer, to describe their clubs. The 1st century Judean writer Philo says these places were also used to teach the law. The earliest reference to these synagogues is from Egypt, from around 230 BCE. The temple, on the other hand, was for sacrifice, not prayer. Prayer was unknown to the old Hebrew religion. Hymns and songs, yes. Prayers, no. The Old Testament nowhere says that the worship of God involves prayers. At the core of the old religion was agricultural sacrifice. You didn't pray during a sacrifice. Moreover, only men with sacrifices were permitted beyond the women's court in the temple compound. In the synagogue, on the other hand, both men and women could offer prayer to God. Sacrifice was redundant. The synagogue provided a model of a communal facility, hitherto unknown to early Judaism, but common in the Greek world. In Judea itself, synagogues were seats of teaching, but not places of prayer. The earliest evidence for a synagogue in Judea is from an inscription found near the Temple Mount, dated to say 50 AD CE, 2 decades before the Great Revolt. Archaeological digs over the past century have uncovered the realities of the Roman synagogue that the rabbis strove mightily to forget. These synagogues are covered in carvings, mosaics and paintings, geometric patterns, fruits, birds, zodiacs, cultic objects like the menorah, animals and biblical scenes. In some synagogues, we find Zeus Helios driving his chariot across the sky. Well, knock me down with a pagan symbol. Although Jewish tradition holds that the rabbis ran the synagogues from their creation, there is no evidence to support that. The synagogues were secular creations. In the next episode, I uncover what the Christians are doing just before the Great Revolt. Thanks for visiting. For show notes, maps, charts, and timelines, visit my website at www.historyinthebible.com. You can even download professional posters for free.